The execution chamber on Threshold Station had stood empty for 300 years. Not once in 3 centuries had the Coalition used it. Today, the lights above it hummed for the first time. It came on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, no alarms, no fleet movements. Just a single human soldier, hands cuffed behind his back, being walked down a corridor that smelled of ozone and old fear, while a junior officer somewhere filed the paperwork like it was any other shift. His name was Corporal Daniel Reyes, 26 years old, though the years sat on him like 40. He'd spent the last 8 months in a cell with a window that showed nothing but stars, and in all that time he had asked for exactly one thing: a working radio, just for an hour, just to hear something other than silence. They had refused him every single time, not out of cruelty, out of indifference, which is sometimes worse. The Vel'tarans called what they were about to do justice. Reyes had killed 11 of their soldiers during a border skirmish that, by every metric the Coalition cared about, had been started by them. But intent didn't matter to the Vel'tarans. Outcome did, and the outcome was 11 dead Vel'tarans and 1 very alive human who refused, even now, to look anything but calm. Director Sale Korath walked 2 steps behind the prisoner, hands folded behind her back, satisfied with how clean this would be. She had handled 400 executions in her career. She knew exactly how this went. The condemned wept or raged or begged. Reyes did none of these things. He hummed, a low, tuneless thing under his breath, like a man waiting for a bus. That detail bothered her more than she let herself admit. She had been doing this job long enough to trust the small wrongness in a room before she trusted the paperwork. And something about this prisoner's stillness sat wrong, in her chest like a stone she couldn't name. If you've been following Humanity Revenge HFY, you already know humans never accept the choices they're given, even the ones that look, on paper, like the only choice left. Korath had read the human's file twice. Infantry. No notable commendations. No family flagged as politically significant. A nobody by every measure that mattered to the Vel'taran command structure, which was exactly why he'd been chosen. An execution with no diplomatic cost. A message sent cheaply. To remind every aligned species watching that the Coalition's patience had limits. What she hadn't read, what nobody in the chain of command had bothered to read, was the small, unremarkable line buried in his enlistment record under next of kin contact protocol. Do not notify. Just 6 words. Nobody had ever asked what they meant. 6 words, filed away in a database that had not been opened in 11 years, waiting for exactly this morning. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who stays till the end of a story like this, hit that like button and subscribe. To Humanity Revenge HFY, this is exactly the kind of story we live for here. Now, back to what happened next. They reached the chamber. It was a small room, almost gentle in its design. Soft lighting, a single chair, restraints that looked more like furniture than instruments. The Vel'tarans believed in clean deaths. They believed cruelty was inefficient, that a frightened prisoner was simply a prisoner who had not yet been properly informed of his odds. Reyes sat down without being told to. He looked at the small camera mounted in the corner, the one broadcasting this moment to exactly 4 Coalition observer worlds as proof of due process, and for the first time he smiled. "You should turn that off," he said. Korath frowned. "It's procedure." "I know," Reyes said. "I'm just telling you. For your sake." She didn't understand the warning. Nobody in the room did. That was box 1, and it would not stay closed for long. She filed it away as the nervous talk of a frightened man, even though watching his hands, she noted they were not shaking at all. The countdown began. 90 seconds, displayed in soft amber numerals above the chair, ticking down with no urgency at all, as if death itself had decided to be polite about it. At 60 seconds, something in the station's lower decks went quiet that should not have gone quiet. A single coolant relay, unremarkable, the kind of system nobody monitored in real time, simply stopped reporting. The technician who noticed it assumed sensor drift and moved on, the way technicians always do, right up until the moment they're proven wrong. At 40 seconds, Reyes closed his eyes, not in fear, in something closer to relief, and the wrongness of that expression would haunt 3 separate witnesses for the rest of their lives. One of them, a junior guard barely out of training, would later say it was the moment she first understood that humans were not what the briefing said they were. At 20 seconds, Korath gave the order to proceed, her voice flat, professional, exactly as it had been 400 times before. At 0, the chamber did exactly what it was built to do, and Corporal Daniel Reyes stopped being a person and became instead a signal. The Vel'tarans didn't know they had a name for what happened next. The humans did. They called it the Shepherd Clause, and it had been sitting dormant in a piece of decommissioned infrastructure for 61 years, waiting for one very specific, very narrow condition to be met: the confirmed, broadcast, verified execution of a human soldier whose enlistment file carried that quiet 6-word flag. Nobody had told the Coalition that humanity had ever built a dead man's switch into the galaxy itself, 300 light-years away, in a research outpost so unremarkable it didn't appear on most star charts. An old woman named Dr. Imogen Vance was drinking tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't noticed. She'd been waiting for this exact alert for 11 years, ever since she'd helped bury the project that made it possible, and when the alarm finally sounded, soft and almost apologetic, she didn't flinch. She didn't call anyone. She simply stood up, walked to a terminal that hadn't been touched since its installation, and typed 8 characters. Then she sat back down and finished pouring tea she would never drink, because that was what she did when there was nothing left to feel about it. She had grieved this day for over a decade, long before it arrived, and grief, she had learned, did not announce itself loudly the second time around. It simply sat down next to you and waited. Humanity had not built a weapon. That was the impossible detail nobody at the Coalition would understand until it was far too late. Weapons were things you pointed. What humanity had built, quietly, across 6 decades, distributed across hundreds of unrelated systems, disguised as agricultural sensors and shipping relays and old communication, satellites nobody bothered decommissioning, was something closer to a nervous system, a single coordinated reflex, triggered only by one act, the killing of a flagged soldier, broadcast and verified beyond doubt. It had never been used, not once in 61 years. 3 other executions by 3 other empires had come dangerously close, and each time, quiet diplomatic channels had intervened just in time, because someone in the human command structure understood exactly what would happen if they didn't. The Vel'tarans had simply never asked the question that would have told them to be careful. They had assumed, as most empires did, that a species without a visible fleet had no teeth at all. By the time anyone on Threshold Station understood what the dead coolant relay had actually meant, it was already too late to matter. That was Box 2 finally closing, far too late for anyone to stop what it had already set in motion, and in the only way the humans had ever intended it to close, quietly. The Coalition called the resulting cascade the Vel'taran Silence. It is studied now in 17 different academic disciplines, and none of them agree on exactly what happened first. What is agreed upon, within 4 hours, every Vel'taran orbital relay within communication range of Threshold Station went dark, not through attack, but through a coordinated failure of trust. Every Coalition-aligned species that had quietly distrusted Vel'taran command for decades suddenly finding, in their own systems, evidence the humans had been patiently feeding them for years. Evidence of corruption, evidence of staged border conflicts, evidence that the 11 dead soldiers Reyes had been executed for killing had, in fact, been ordered into that skirmish specifically to manufacture a justification for tightening Vel'taran control over 3 contested systems. Humans hadn't started a war. They had spent 61 years quietly proving one didn't need to happen, and they had simply been waiting for someone to give them a reason to release what they'd already built. Not one action, 100 small actions, distributed, coordinated, executed by people who had practiced the theory of this day, until it had stopped feeling like a contingency and started feeling like memory. Somewhere in that 100 small actions was a junior systems engineer named Priya Okonkwo, 22 years old, who had spent the entire crisis doing nothing more dramatic than verifying checksums on data packets. She had helped write 3 years earlier as part of a training rotation she barely remembered, volunteering for. Her hands shook the whole time. Her math did not. When it was over, she made herself a cup of instant coffee, drank exactly half of it, and went back to her quarters to call her mother, because that was what she did. When the world had asked too much of her and given her no good way to talk about it. Before I close this one out, if this story stayed with you, drop a comment below. Tell me the moment that hit hardest. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded what humans are actually made of, share this with them. Humanity Revenge HFY grows one story at a time. And this community is why we keep telling them. Now here's how it ended. Director Sale Korath stood in the execution chamber 4 days later, alone, watching the empty chair. Her career was over. Her government was fracturing into competing factions, each blaming the others for a catastrophe none of them had seen coming, and all of them had, somewhere, quietly helped cause. She had asked repeatedly to see the file on Daniel Reyes, the full file, not the sanitized version she'd been handed before the execution. When it finally came, 3 pages long, she read the 6 words under next of kin contact protocol 4 separate times before she understood them. Do not notify. He has no one. It wasn't a redaction. It wasn't a secret. It was simply true. Reyes had grown up in a state care system with no family, had enlisted at 18 because it was the only door open to him, and had spent his entire adult life as exactly what the Coalition had assumed. A nobody. The kind of soldier whose death would cost nothing. The kind of soldier nobody would ever come looking for. What no one had told her, what humanity had apparently decided decades ago never to advertise, was that the Shepherd Clause didn't care about rank, or family, or political weight. It cared about one thing only: that a human being, any human being, had been killed for the convenience of someone else's narrative, and that the killing had been broadcast as proof of how little that life had mattered. The clause existed precisely for the soldiers no one else would ever fight for. It was, in its quiet way, the loneliest kind of promise a species had ever kept. Korath sat down in the chair Reyes had occupied. She thought about the hum he'd made, low and tuneless like a man waiting for a bus. She understood it now. He hadn't been calm because he expected to be saved. He'd been calm because he'd known, the moment they read him the charges, exactly what his death would cost the people who ordered it. He had simply decided not to give them the satisfaction of watching him be afraid. She thought he must have been very lonely. All those months with no radio, no voice from outside, asking for nothing but an hour of sound from a world that had already written him off twice over, once by the system that raised him, and once by the empire that killed him. She found, to her own surprise, that this thought cost her something she did not have a word for in her own language. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for it, and even if she had been, it wouldn't have changed anything. She simply sat in the chair a long time, in the particular stillness of someone who has survived something real and isn't sure yet what surviving it means. On the other side of the galaxy, Dr. Imogen Vance stood at the edge of a small memorial garden that had been planted for exactly this purpose, 61 years ago by people who had hoped never to need it. There was a single stone there now, freshly placed, with a name on it that most of the galaxy would never learn to pronounce correctly, and underneath it, 8 words chosen long before Daniel Reyes was even born. He asked for almost nothing, and we heard him. She straightened her collar, the way she always did when no one was watching, and walked back inside to finish the tea she had let go cold. Behind her, the garden held 40 other stones, planted decades ago, each one waiting, each one hoping never to be needed. And now one of them finally had a name. Even Mercy has teeth. And humanity had simply been waiting for 61 years to find out if anyone would ever make them show it.